how did this all happen? So I was in refugee camps in Honduras in 1982, 83, when, okay, you'll figure out my age, when I was 19 and 20 years old. And I'll show a few slides from that. And that eventually, over a number of years later, led to this question about slow sand filters, which is one of the water treatment technologies that makes a lot of sense for small communities. And I learned about that in a course kind of like this one, a traditional water treatment class, and discovered that the professor let it out, that we don't actually know how these filters work. And that was like, oh, that's cool. No one knows how these filters work, and yet there are millions of people that depend on them. Wouldn't it be cool to figure out how they work? I had an invitation to begin a water project in Latin America that happened in December of 2002, where a colleague said, hey, do you want to do a project in Latin America? And I love Latin America, and I was like, yes, of course. And that ended up connecting me with folks that I knew from Honduras from my time there in the refugee camps back in the early 80s. And that eventually led to this question from the partner organization in Honduras saying, hey, how could we treat this water that we're providing to small communities? And I realized that everything that I had been taught, and by then I had a PhD in environmental engineering, and I realized that all that I had learned and had been taught about water treatment wasn't enough to solve that problem, and that we needed more and better solutions. And so we've been working on that. And this is wow, this is 18 years later, 16 times having taught a course like this. And we keep on learning, and there is still a lot more to learn. Like, there are still many, many places where it's like, wow, I think this might be happening in this process, but we don't know for sure. And we certainly don't know how to optimize the process because we don't have any equations yet that describe it. So much more to learn. Here's just a few pictures from the 80s, seeing refugees from El Salvador wait in line to get water, seeing them use water. Here they're washing corn that they're going to use to make tortillas. Realizing that this is a water source for towns. This is the water source for a town in Honduras, and that is the water that used to be coming out of their taps, and thinking, yeah, this is a real problem. We need a solution to this. And this is that town. This is that town of Morosili that gets water from that river, and they need a better solution than that dirty water coming out of their taps. So I began to search, and I call this a search of truth that matters. But maybe you wonder, like, is this really the right thing to be doing? Like, should you really be taking a course that's like an environmental engineering class? Shouldn't you instead be taking a business course or information technology course? Like, environmental engineers have been applying the same drinking water solutions for the past 100 years. And goodness, the science behind environmental engineering is well understood. It's the same old stuff. And really, it's not up to us. Providing everyone on the planet with safe drinking water, it's not about engineering. It's about the money and the political will to actually apply those known technologies, because we already know how to treat drinking water. Okay. Could we break into breakout rooms for like do you agree?
Yeah,
do you disagree? What don't you like? What do you like? Are you going to switch your major now?
Students, you should be able to join the rooms now. Let me know if you can't.
Think about how much time to give them. And let's see, it's 3. We're doing fine for time, I think.
Yeah, we still have 40 minutes. I'd say 3-4 minutes.
Yeah.
Maybe
Okay.
3:05.
Yeah.
I am surprised with how many of these students I know. So I think it'll be a good group. I think there's only a handful that I have not met before. So
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's great. So you already have rapport with these folks.
a lot of them are from the capstone. So
Yeah, that's beautiful.
usually it gives them like a minute,
minute.
before it
Yeah,
pushes them back.
here they come. Well, welcome back, everyone. And this was like Monroe. Monroe was very clear that I was going to do things that were challenging, and Hannah came back and let me know, yeah, this was hard because you didn't have access to see the screen where the question, where the slide was, that I was asking you to respond to. So sorry about that. And I'll try to figure out a better way to handle this in Zoom for the next time I want you to respond to something that's on a slide like this. And I'm curious, how did you think about this? I'd just love any responses of, like, how might you respond if, I mean, Monroe just told you these things. How would you respond? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Why don't you agree? Why do you agree? Are you going to switch to business majors now? Go for it. Be brave, jump in, say what you have on your mind.
Okay, so we had like 2 things, and my team said I could speak for them, so I will. The first was that you mentioned why even study this stuff, should we just switch to business major? And the people who know these means and methods are out there, but they're not going to be around forever. So it's still important to teach the things that we're using now. And then the second component is that these things are being implemented in the place where there's political will, but we might need to come up with new methods in the future for places where there isn't that political will, or maybe isn't the economics that allow them to be implemented.
Good job, Dan. Thank you. And your group. Who else would like to jump in with some things that your group said in response to this?
Being able to look at the prompt again, and going off of what Dan said, just like wherever you go, when it comes to the or like just resources in the area, especially in places that don't have as many resources, you're always going to encounter problems. It's almost inevitable. I feel like over the 100 years, there's you consistently run into problems, no matter how much you plan for them, either unforeseen or ones that you can anticipate. But I think just like you can try to throw money at it, but some of these problems that are so unforeseen, you need those engineers that can think outside the box for those problems so essentially you wouldn't know what problems to throw money at until the engineers had actually figured out a solution to those unforeseen problems. So you're always going to need engineers to anticipate those unforeseen problems that somehow always find a way to exist in history when it comes down to creating new technology.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, Eric. Who else would like to jump in?
I know it says like the science behind environmental engineering is already well understood, but I mean, as we progress and like people continue learning and exploring, like there will be new technologies that are explored, and I believe they'll be figured out and could be applied in a lot of wide range applications across the globe, and definitely will continue to evolve and potentially even lower the cost and make it more accessible. So I definitely think that it's not necessarily entirely understood. I think there's probably steps that we can take to still learn more, just so we can be better off in the future.
Excellent. Thank you. And I want to be really clear. Although environmental engineers have been doing things for safe water for over 100 years, there's still many things that we do not understand well. And there's still plenty of room for all of you to help innovate and create better solutions. So this was a slide that was not what I believe. It was just to get you thinking, to see if you really believed us or not. So I'm going to move on. So this is my perspective on human knowledge. You know, you can think of knowledge as like there's this sphere that humans are like slowly pushing out on. Think of it like a balloon, and we're slowly pushing that surface of the balloon out further and further as we learn more and more things. So there's our balloon, and we slowly expand it, and hopefully it keeps on expanding. It doesn't contract again like that one did. So that knowledge keeps on growing. That's one image. But now here's another image. Maybe it's not like that spherical balloon. Maybe it's like this. It's just craziness. Like there are places where we know a whole lot about how something works. So maybe there's some piece of nanotechnology where we just know a whole lot about how those atoms are interacting with each other, and how to make nanoscale structures. And we know a whole lot about how to make different kinds of drugs. Just a huge amount of information there. And maybe we know a tiny bit about what it takes to purify water. And this is an old one. This slide does go back to the very early days of the course. And you guys, you know, might not even know what WMD is. Anybody know what WMD is? It's weapons of mass destruction. And it was the term that was thrown around at the beginning or prior to the Iraq War. And a number of countries on the planet, United States being the best at this, is we know a ton about weapons of mass destruction because we've got lots of them. And so there's lots of engineering that has gone into creating the best ways of destroying the planet. And in this course, we're working at that little valley where we know a little bit about water purification. We're going to try to like push that valley up a little bit and maybe borrow from some adjacent knowledge spaces, maybe learn new things. And here's just like one of the funny ways that like it needs to be interdisciplinary. Like if you think about environmental engineering has historically been closely connected to chemical engineering. And so many chemical engineers or many environmental engineers have a degree in chemical engineering as well. So that connection has been very, very strong. And a connection with biology has become very strong as well. A connection that might not have been as strong is a connection with fluids, like fluid mechanics, even though we're dealing with water. And it turns out that that connection is super, super critical for figuring out how to design good water treatment plants. And I've recently wondered, like, is that one of the issues why it's so hard to get really good water treatment plants designed? It's because we don't actually have enough people who understand fluids well in environmental engineering. Who knows? But in any case, borrow from neighboring areas. So we're part of this search of truth that matters, trying to extend this balloon of knowledge. Agua Clara is creating new technologies, and this course is part of that effort to help create new technologies. We developed the design algorithms for surface water treatment plants of any size so that we can design plants, whether they're really tiny plants or big plants, we can design any of them. And it's this beautiful thing where we connect math and physics and fluid mechanics and chemistry and geometry and economics and all those things to actually create a design. I have this memory of the first time I took a course in water supply engineering, and as part of that course, we designed a flocculator. And I remember after designing that flocculator, I was very confused because we knew how to design the volume of the flocculator, but we didn't know how to design how deep it should be or how wide it should be or how long it should be. We didn't have any insight about how we would set those parameters. And those parameters come from like knowing more about the whole story, about how everything fits together. And then finally, there ends up being constraints that help guide the selection of every single dimension that goes into a plant. So that's where like the geometry ends up being a really interesting part of the design process. And another piece here, I get very excited about the fact, have you ever thought about this? Like, for example, there's this equation, F equals ma, right? You've all heard that one. F equals ma. Have you ever got excited about the fact that you can write down an equation and it actually means something? And you can take that equation and you can do algebra on it. Like you could divide both sides by F, or no, divide both sides by M. And then you could have F over M equals A. And that still means something. Isn't that amazing that the universe works that way? Like there could have been an alternate universe where none of that worked and it was just like chaotic and who knows what was going to happen today. So happiness that we can actually describe our reality using equations. And that's kind of at the core of what allows us to do things as engineers and be able to actually design things that even before we build it, we have a very strong sense that it's going to work because happily those equations do link with the physical reality. Okay, and then there's this other side. Oh man, what about when things go wrong? And groupthink is an example of things going wrong. And I'm trying to get you to not be part of groupthink, but to actually be willing to ask questions and to be willing to say that you don't believe what Monroe says. Groupthink refers to a faulty decision-making process where you're part of a group and you all decide to go down one path and you don't consider alternatives. And as a group, what you value most is that you all agree with each other and you value that more than finding the truth. And in that case, you easily come up with solutions that you all agree on that are actually perhaps dangerous or perhaps result in the Challenger disaster or something like that. The question is, how do you prevent groupthink where you all are happy to come up with a solution even if it's wrong because you all agree? Here's some ideas to help prevent that. So one is to admit that you don't know everything. I, Monroe Weber Shirk, do not know everything. Matter of fact, I only know a little bit about a very small number of things. So most things I know nothing about at all. Encourage honesty. Question everything. Just because someone says something with confidence doesn't mean that you should believe that it's true. Just like those sentences that I said about engineers and why you should all be business majors instead. Like you should like, huh, really? Is he serious? Like, does this actually make sense? Or is there another way to state that is actually much clearer and closer to reality? Be alert to jargon that doesn't actually mean anything. It is very, very easy to put sentences together with lots of technical jargon and it doesn't actually mean anything. So just because somebody can put long words together doesn't mean that they're communicating great ideas. You could check with outside experts to see whether, like, do they agree with this proposal that you're making for how you're going to proceed as a group? And this last one is hold a second chance meeting. This is like after you're pretty sure you're going to go down a path, and then you could be like, okay, we're going to very deliberately raise a question right now about, is there some failure mode that we're not thinking about that would make this idea that we're about to embark on be a bad idea? Like maybe those O-rings in that Challenger are really too cold and they're not going to create a good seal at this temperature. So hold a second chance meeting where you are very open to dissent. And oh my goodness, a lot of this is about, you have to be open to people who have different opinions. And you can't like clamp down on them and tell them to be quiet when they share a different idea that is different from the one that you had hoped to hear. How might environmental engineers fall in this thing of groupthink? Like I've been working on, I worked on slow sand filters for more than a decade. I don't want to discover that my technology is obsolete and that the years of effort that I put into it might have been a waste. But you know what? We're humans and we learn things, and it's entirely possible that something that you dedicate a decade of your life on ends up being not a great idea. And it's far better to recognize that and move on than it is to like buckle down and say, I'm going to keep on working on slow sand filtration no matter what anybody says, right? It's far better to learn, say, okay, yeah, you're right. I've got to do something different. We can confuse confidence and proof. Like just because someone who looks like they're an authority figure says something with a lot of confidence in their voice, that doesn't mean that it's true. It means that they're confident, but it doesn't mean that it's true. A reliance on empiricism rather than physics. So like, okay, we made all these measurements and we conclude something, but we don't actually have any like understanding of what is going on underneath, like what is making the physics work this way. And a confusion, we can fall into groupthink by thinking that just because we have the ability to use big words that we understand what we're talking about. So we can reduce groupthink by creating a safe environment for questions and for learning, and for people to say things that we disagree with, and then to have an open discussion. Is there myth in engineering? Is there myth in engineering? So when I talk about myth, myth can be a useful way of understanding a complex reality. So we use stories, we use myth to talk about creation stories, for example. Myth can also be used to describe generally accepted but unproven hypotheses. So that's how I'm using it here, where there are things that engineers and scientists and others tend to believe, and they think it's true, but it's actually a myth because it's unproven and it was a hypothesis, and they didn't continue to hold the question of, is it really a pretty solidly known thing, or is it just a hypothesis that doesn't actually have a whole lot of support yet? So here's myth number one: science and engineering aren't influenced by myth because they are based on the scientific method. And that's a myth. Because yes, we try to base our things on the scientific method, but we're humans and we often jump to conclusions when we shouldn't yet jump to conclusions. So examples of myth, these are old ones. Malaria, the word malaria means bad air. And so it wasn't that mosquitoes that were biting you, it's just that it was bad air. There's this myth that streams purify themselves in 1 mile. There's the idea that, oh, when your child gets typhoid, it's because they were outside and there was air coming out of the ground under conditions of low or sinking groundwater, and that's why they got sick with typhoid. So people try to figure out cause and effect, and sometimes it's completely bogus. And here's one that's really close to home for environmental engineers. We would like to believe, and there are plenty of textbooks that would show this, that chlorine eliminated typhoid in the United States. And I would happily have an hour-long discussion about that and show that the data doesn't actually support that. It was what the engineers at the time, at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, what they wanted to believe, and they thought it just made so much sense, and so they interpreted the data in that way. But chlorine didn't actually eliminate typhoid. So be skeptical. Expose that myth, and maybe we can expose some more myths. And the first thing that you should do is you should not believe everything that I say. You should always be asking, how do we know that? Or why can't we do this better? And this is disclosure time. There are many, many things that I have taught in this class over the 16 times that I've taught it in previous years that I now know are wrong, or at least are incomplete understandings. So that's the state of knowledge. We are learning things. We don't know everything yet. The book is not yet closed. There's much more to learn. The challenge that we're facing is creating sustainable municipal drinking water supplies that provide entire towns with safe water on tap. And I would argue that we need the brightest and the best to create new and better solutions so that we can meet that goal. And apparently, this challenge is more difficult than building a space station, or designing a fuel cell, or designing and building the Webb telescope, because all of those things have already been done. And we have not yet figured out how to provide everyone on the planet with safe drinking water. So let's roll up our sleeves and begin. It's a short walk to the edge of knowledge. There's a lot to learn. The edge is very close by. And if you never get anywhere this semester where you're like, wait, I don't know the answer to that, and I ask Monroe and he doesn't seem to know the answer either. If you don't get there, you've not tried very hard. You should get to the place where you don't know the answer and Monroe doesn't know the answer. And maybe even Patrick doesn't know the answer. Okay, and it's okay. Remember, most things we don't know. We only know a few things, and we're working on expanding that. So it's a short walk to the edge of knowledge. There are significant knowledge gaps in every process that I will be teaching about. We aren't able to optimize surface water treatment processes because we don't yet understand the fundamental physics of many of those processes. We're working on that. We're getting closer, but there's still a ton to learn.